Hello, everybody. First, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be able to join you today. It's one of the strange little upsides of the coronavirus situation that I get the opportunity to visit humanist organizations from all around the world. And so it's a particular pleasure for me to be coming into Plymouth and all over the UK with some people from different parts of the UK, which is, as you can probably tell from my accent, where I'm from. I'm a Londoner. I was born and bred in London. I was a high school teacher in London. I went to university in the UK, and then I moved out to the US to do graduate work. And one day I hope to return to my island home. But right now, as Ben said, I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, where I am the leader of the Ethical Society of St. Louis. Now, I'm going to tell you today the story of the ethical culture movement, which is the name of the religious movement of which the Ethical Society of St. Louis is a part, and which forms a really important link between traditional religions and today's secular humanism. But so I can put that into a bit of context for people who've never heard of an ethical society before, we're essentially like a big version of the Plymouth Humanist group that has its own building and very, very many regular meetings and hundreds of members and things like that. So it's really like a church, but for humanists with no traditional religious elements like prayer or scripture or something like that. And I am their professional clergy person, so I provide the functions of a traditional priest or vicar or something like that, just for a congregation of humanists. And so part of my job is telling people like you what we do and why we think ethical societies are important. But this presentation is going to be a bit different from any of the others I've ever given on our history, because I'm going to try and link it into the history of British humanism, because there are some really fascinating links between the ethical culture movement and humanism in the UK that I'm going to try and bring out for you today. So with that little preamble in place, I'm going to start by giving you a story about the founding of the first ethical society, and then lead that into British humanism and show the connections there. The year is 1873, and the 22-year-old philosopher Felix Adler has just returned from his studies in Germany to give his first sermon in his father's synagogue, Temple Emmanuel in New York. Adler was expected to succeed his father as rabbi and had been sent to Germany to study religion. When he got there, though, like so many children, he sidestepped away from his parents' wishes and studied philosophy instead, becoming enamored with neo-Kantian and transcendentalist thinkers. When he arose to speak at Temple Emmanuel, the anticipation must have been great. This was the first sermon of a prodigal son returned, they thought, to their Jewish flock. Adler's skill as an orator, a skill which would soon draw overflowing crowds to hear him speak at Carnegie Hall and see his addresses printed in the New York Times, must have been on clear display. What would this short, slight young man, his heart filled with the spiritual energy of Emerson, his head swimming with the ideas of Immanuel Kant, say to his father's congregation? He called his sermon "The Judaism of the Future," and in it he outlined a radical new departure for Judaism, which centered on universal human ethics and right relations between people, rather than on the rituals, symbols, and ethnic identity of traditional Judaism. And to cap it all off, he didn't once mention God. Adler was not given the job as his father's replacement. Indeed, he was never invited to speak at his father's temple again. But that moment, that turning point in Adler's life, led him to found Ethical Culture, the tradition I represent as clergy for the Ethical Society of St. Louis. What was it that Adler said in his address which so shocked his father's congregation that they never invited him back? Well, lucky for you, and lucky for everyone in the ethical movement, the recently retired leader emerita of the New York Society for Ethical Culture was clearing out her office in September of last year and came upon a copy of that very address delivered in Temple Emmanuel on 11th of October, 1873. And until then, we didn't know that we had a copy of it. So it was really interesting to be able to see what he said, to see the development of his religious and philosophical ideas. That sermon opened with these words: "A tranquil summer's eve was closing in upon Jerusalem as Rabbi Yosef dragged his way wearily through the desolate streets of Zion toward the hill of the temple. Fallen stones and mouldering masses blocked the path. The houses were empty, and wolves and jackals howled in the halls, where once no sound was heard save the measured tread of the silent priest or the loud swelling of Levitic choirs." In his story, Adler weaves an epic narrative ranging from that desolate Sepphoris, where Yosef built a school amongst the ruins, to the time of the Jewish Enlightenment of the 18th and 19th centuries, to stories from classical antiquity, fairy tales. Adler had a philosopher's mind, a storyteller's heart, and a vast range of interests, and all three were on full display at Temple Emmanuel that morning. Yet there are a number of key argumentative threads in Adler's address in which we can see, I think, the genesis of what would become ethical culture, a set of ideas that has profoundly influenced humanist thinking even to this day. First, very clear in Adler's conception of the history of Judaism is his view of it as an evolving tradition, one not defined by the specific rites and religious practices of traditional Judaism, but by the call to a higher way of living. In each stage of the Jewish journey that he relates in his sermon, whether it's Rabbi Yosef in Sepphoris where he begins, or Mendelssohn during the Jewish Enlightenment, or the leaders of the Reform Jewish movement of his own day, it's clear that Adler identifies not with those who wanted to cling to religious rituals of the past, but with those who sought progress and rejuvenation. Adler sees change as a chance to throw out stifling religious shackles and rededicate Judaism to what he sees as its central work, promoting ethical behavior, or in the famous Reform Jewish phrase, tikkun olam, healing the world. In this, he was following the path of the Jewish Reform movement of which his father was a part. His father, too, wanted to refocus Judaism and trim away some of its more esoteric elements. But Adler, distinct from his father, was not content with piecemeal reform of the religion which stopped at some arbitrary point. He wanted to take reform of Judaism to its logical limit, to its ultimate, push it as far as it could possibly go. Adler saw the reform movement in Judaism as part of a process, not as a destination. And so naturally, he asks, what's next? What's the next thing we have to get rid of to really get to the root of things? His answer was ominous. For Adler believed that while the reform movement had done a lot of good work clearing away old things from Judaism, they'd failed to replace what they had torn down with anything compelling and new. And so that's the second strand of Adler's thinking. He wanted to go right back to the roots of religion, strip away absolutely everything non-essential, and build something new focused purely on those roots. So Adler wasn't just a reformer, he was a radical in the original sense of that word, someone who wants to get back to the roots of something. He wasn't concerned much with the dead ground he would have to hack through and dig up in order to get to those roots. All of that, he thought, could be chucked away. So what were the roots of religion which he thought had to be recovered? In Adler's mind, the root of all religious philosophies is ethical idealism, the highest values which reside in people, which call us to moral behavior. At the heart of Adler's religious conception was the idea that religion is fundamentally about uplifting the best in the human spirit. And Adler, unlike really any of the Jewish intellectuals of his time, was willing to chuck out absolutely everything about Judaism which wasn't about that. He didn't see this as doing any injustice to the Jewish tradition. Rather, he understood himself to be returning to the true heart of that tradition. For him, the specific scriptures, creedal beliefs, religious practices, etc. of contemporary Judaism, the Judaism of his day, were the extraneous parts of the tradition. It was the character of the Jewish people and the morals that they demonstrated through their history which was central to his idea of what Judaism was, not their specific religious beliefs. And that meant that one of the things he considered extraneous to Judaism was God. Now, I mentioned earlier that the members of Temple Emmanuel were shocked not to hear Adler mention God once in his sermon. But that rather underplays how deeply humanistic, in a broad sense, his presentation was. The story of Judaism Adler presented that morning is entirely focused on its natural history and on the Jewish people. He makes moving reference to the historic oppression of the Jews, being driven from land to land, being treated as pariahs, and dwells on the spirit of a people who can endure so many generations of hardship. Yet he talks not a bit about any God which has a special covenant with them. Rather, he uplifts them for their moral character. Adler sees the strength of the Jewish tradition, indeed the very identity of Judaism, in the character of the Jewish people, not in their religious beliefs. It is their steadfastness, their industriousness, their compassion, their dedication to community and family, which defines for Adler Jewishness itself. And that identification of Jewishness with Jewish values, rather than within any particular doctrines, practices, or beliefs of the Jewish faith, which allows Adler to make the most surprising and possibly for the audience that day, the most troubling move in his whole address. He expands the notion of Judaism such that it encompasses all people who share those values. So he identifies the Jewish tradition with a particular set of moral values, and then he says that anyone can have those moral values. So it doesn't have to be a distinct thing set aside for one small part of the population. And at one point in that address, he makes his intentions crystal clear, saying, "Listen to the clear metallic notes that ring from the pulpits of the free religionists here and elsewhere. Do you not hear the great humanitarian doctrines of Judaism re-echo in their words? Are not they too the children of the prophets, our brothers? We discard the narrow spirit of exclusion and loudly proclaim that Judaism was not given to the Jews alone, but that its destiny is to embrace in one great moral state the whole family of man. And so what Adler is creating here is a sort of proto-humanism, a humanism that comes out of the Jewish tradition, as expressed initially at least in explicitly Jewish terms, but which basically says that what he wants to create is a movement that's based on a certain set of common human values that can be found in religious traditions all the world over and in non-religious philosophies, and that everyone should be able to get together to dedicate their lives to that. So Adler that morning made his case. The Judaism of the future, as he called it, would be one focused not on the doctrines, rituals, or even ethnic identity of traditional Judaism, but on the ethical values demonstrated through right action. It would become a universal religion, laying, as he says, its greatest stress not on the believing in, but on the acting out. A religion not of creed, but of deed. It will fully accept the results of science, regardless of the beliefs or disbeliefs the scientific pursuit engenders. It need not even appeal to a personal God. Adler ended his address with a rousing vision of the future of religion. Behold, in the dim distance, I see it rise before me, the temple of the future. Justice its foundation, peace and goodwill its columns, and the vast firmament of heaven itself, its high dome. From all sides the nations gather, a mighty pilgrimage to its halls. On that day shall the genius of religion stand forth as the high priest of the people, and as the chorus of praise swells louder and louder amid the echoing voices of the enfranchised millions, again shall it proclaim its great humanitarian doctrine, its eternal watchword: one truth, one love, one hope in the highest, and one great brotherhood of men on earth. And all the nations there shall answer as with one accord, Amen, Amen. One truth, one love, one hope. I'm pretty sure those are the lyrics to a U2 song. So, as in many things, Adler was ahead of his time in that too. In truth, for all the rhetorical bombast and youthful passion in Adler's address to Temple Emmanuel, his vision of Judaism and of religion as a whole was genuinely radical. It was a departure in religious thinking. Indeed, so radical was Adler's vision of Judaism that, in the words of one ethical culture leader, Arthur Dobrin, in essence, he reformed Judaism to a point that it was no longer Judaism. Because if you take away the idea of the Jews as a chosen people, if you discard the specific ritual practices of Judaism, if you allow science to do away with the idea of God, and if you open the doors to all humanity, then do you really have a form of Judaism anymore? I don't think so. I think you have essentially a proto-humanism, the idea of a connected set of ethical principles that anybody can hold, regardless of their beliefs about God or the supernatural, which stresses the dignity of people above all else. But regardless of what I think, that most of the members of Temple Emmanuel thought that what he was offering was not Judaism. And so Adler didn't get that job as his father's replacement. But some of the members of his father's temple were so enthralled by Adler's vision and so inspired by him as a person that they couldn't let that vision go. They wanted to create a place where all people could come and worship good together. Adler believed that religious differences in beliefs about the nature and existence of God, who was the best or final prophet, which texts encoded the divine will, etc., put up unnecessary barriers between people, which need not be erected. He saw at the heart of all the world's great religious traditions an ethical core, a concern for right living, and he wanted to extract that core, which he thought is the heart of religion, from all the dogma and ritual and beliefs which surrounded it, and create something new. And so, with the support of a number of members of his father's temple, Adler did build something new. The first ethical society, the New York Society for Ethical Culture. This is the building that they would go on to build together. It's that whole city block from 63rd and Central Park West to 62nd and Central Park West. The left-hand part is the school that he built, and the right-hand part is the congregation that he built. And it is, if you imagine to the left of the image, just across the road in the picture, is Central Park. So this is prime real estate. This was an influential endeavor at the time when it was built. And they still hold meetings in that building for the New York Society for Ethical Culture to this day. Ethical societies, such as the one he built in New York, would not be dedicated toward the exploration and promotion of any particular religious creed. They would be dedicated towards goodness itself. And that's how Adler described his goal in the address that he gave at the founding of the first ethical society, this ethical society. Now, I'm going to quote Adler at length here, so apologies for that, but I think it's useful to get a sense of the direction of his philosophical and religious thinking when he's moved away from thinking of himself as Jewish and is crafting something entirely different that doesn't have any real connections to the Jewish faith at all. This is part of what he said that day. Candidly do I confess that it is my dearest object to exalt the present moment above the strife of contending sects and parties, and at once to occupy that common ground where we may all meet, believers and unbelievers, for purposes in themselves lofty and unquestioned by any. The freedom of thought is a sacred right of every individual, and diversity will continue to increase with the progress, refinement, and differentiation of the human intellect. But if difference be inevitable, nay, welcome in thought, there is a sphere in which unanimity and fellowship are above all things needful. Believe or disbelieve as ye list, we shall at all times respect every honest conviction, but be one with us where there is nothing to divide. In action, diversity in the creed, unanimity in the deed. This is that practical religion from which none dissents. This is that platform broad enough and solid enough to receive the worshipper and the infidel. This is that common ground where we may all grasp hands as brothers united in mankind's common cause. The Hebrew prophet said of old, to serve Jehovah is to make your hearts pure and your hands clean from corruption, to help the suffering, to raise the oppressed. Jesus of Nazareth said that he came to comfort the weary and heavy laden. The philosopher affirms that the true service of religion is the unselfish service of the common weal. There is no difference among them all. So notice how Adler frames his enterprise here and how it carries forward the ideas that he first expressed at his father's congregation. He specifically points to Christianity, Judaism, and the philosopher, which I take to be a reference to what we would now call secular ethical philosophies, and says, let's stop arguing about the source of the moral law because you all agree on the moral law itself. So why not come and seek the good together in one community? The vision was that ethical societies would be a place where people could come together to develop our moral insight and renew our moral energy without reference to the particular beliefs of any existing religion. If there is any other life beyond this one, Adler thought, well, we could build an ethical society when we got there and figure out those problems then. But here, in this place, we would examine how to be good now. No one would be excluded from joining the congregation because of their religious beliefs. It would be a universal congregation based on ethics alone, an ethical society. You can see, I hope, how this is a humanistic idea before the time of organized humanism, really. He was doing this at the end of the 19th and the very beginning of the 20th centuries. He had this universal moral ideal with the hope of bringing all humankind together in one space to work on common human problems. Now, certainly he expresses that in language which would make many humanists uncomfortable today, and which I certainly don't use when I speak to my community on Sunday. But the core philosophical concepts that ethics is kind of free floating from religion, actually, and that you can be an ethical person whether you believe in God or not, and that you had responsibilities to each other regardless of your religious beliefs, all find a home, I think, in contemporary humanism. And it's striking to me that at the end of the 19th century, he was creating an institution which openly welcomed people who didn't believe in God, which was much more controversial then in the United States than it is even today. And he was openly welcoming people to come and join his community if they didn't have any traditional religious beliefs. His desire for his communities to be welcome to everyone is also represented in the structure and practices of ethical societies. And that's the same to this day. For instance, all kinds of religious ritual are excluded from ethical society gatherings to make sure that no one feels left out. Adler didn't want anyone to feel like they were too much like they were in a Christian church because they had a Christian hymn, or too much like they were in a synagogue because there was a menorah. Adler said himself, we propose to entirely exclude prayer and every form of ritual. Thus, we avoid even the appearance of interfering with those to whom prayer and ritual as a mode of expressing religious sentiment are dear. And on the other hand, we shall be just to those who have ceased to regard them as satisfactory and have dispensed with them in their own persons. So you see again how he's trying to create a space where everyone can come together, and he thinks the best way to do that is to exclude any type of religious ritual at all. This is an interesting contrast, incidentally, with Unitarian churches today, which try and do religious pluralism often by including all of the different things about different religions instead of excluding all of them. It's just a kind of different approach to religious pluralism. So the way we hold our gatherings at the Ethical Society of St. Louis, there's no candles, no prayers, no kneeling, no hymns, although occasionally we sing a song together. None of those trappings of traditional religions. It's designed specifically to reflect our commitment to creating a congregation where anyone can attend and feel welcome. So that's how ethical culture, now known as ethical humanism, was born. And we are now a network of humanist congregations across the United States, which are kind of like churches, but no religious ritual, prayer, scripture, or talk of God. It's almost like a Sunday assembly has been given its own building and meets every week, like rather like that. And the ethical movement, as our tradition is collectively known, had a profound impact on the spread of what we now call humanism as a worldview, both in the United States and internationally. And so that's what the last part of my presentation today is about, the impact of ethical culture on humanism more broadly, including particularly humanism in the UK. Because it turns out that Adler was an incredibly charismatic person. He traveled the United States and internationally, and wherever he went, ethical societies sprouted, including across Europe, South America, and, of course, the United Kingdom. The person who's most important to this part of the ethical culture story is this guy, Stanton Coit. I love this photo that I found of him, which is Stanton Coit at the beach. But if you want something a little more professional looking, I love how he has almost like a cape on. I don't know if that was a towel cape was a thing that they wore back then, but I think we should bring it back because I think he looks very dashing in his towel cape. But this is what he looked like when he was at work. He was an aide to Felix Adler, the founder of ethical culture in the United States, and he studied similar ideas in similar circles. And after working with Adler and the ethical movement in the States, Coit moved to London, where he became minister of the South Place Religious Society, which was a religious, a liberal religious congregation in London that has been very influential in free-thinking circles across the UK. And under his leadership, he renamed that organization to the South Place Ethical Society. Now, anybody with any interest in the history of humanism should know of the South Place Ethical Society because it became Conway Hall, which is now one of the most significant humanist cultural institutions in the country and probably in the world. Now, Conway Hall is now a place which offers lectures and educational events. But the South Place Ethical Society, which is still in existence in a certain form, was once a fully fledged humanist congregation, just like my own ethical society in St. Louis. It was just a translation of the same ideas across the Atlantic. And more important even than that, for the history of humanism in the UK, is that Stanton Coit is actually responsible for founding the organization that would become Humanists UK, of which the Plymouth Humanists are a member. After a few years of diligent work in the United Kingdom, there were a number of ethical societies across the country, and Coit established the Union of Ethical Societies to coordinate and support their efforts. And that organization became the Ethical Union in the 1920s. And in the 60s, it hired its first executive director, Harold Blackham, who is known as the father of British humanism. And a few years later, the Union of Ethical Societies again changed its name, this time to the British Humanist Association. And the BHA in 2017, under the leadership of another great humanist, my friend Andrew Copson, changed its name again to Humanists UK. So we have the genealogy of British humanism from Felix Adler and the American ethical culture movement, to Stanton Coit, his student and aide, to the South Place Ethical Society, now Conway Hall, the Ethical Union in the UK, to Harold Blackham, the father of British humanism, to Humanists UK. So on behalf of the American Ethical Union and the remaining ethical societies in the USA, I would like to say, you're welcome. Without us, there may not have been a Humanists UK for Plymouth Humanists to be a part of. But in all seriousness, there probably would have been. Adler and his contemporaries were swimming in intellectual currents which were trending in a humanistic direction. And there are tons of important figures who contributed to the ideas that they developed in those heady times. Lots of people were having similar thoughts. The idea that we needed to sort of rescue religion from its own dogmas and outdated practices and keep some of the good things about it, but discard all of the bad things, including belief in God. But I do, as I close my presentation, want to offer an observation about the trajectory of British humanism and more broadly humanism worldwide since the times of Felix Adler and Stanton Coit to today, which explores a little bit as to why I don't think we have the impact we should have as a social movement. I think Felix Adler and many of his contemporaries had a key insight that has been lost by the contemporary humanist movement, and that is their appreciation for the importance of building institutions. Harold Blackham, and later humanists following his lead, consciously dismantled many of the more churchy parts of the ethical societies that still existed, moving them away from a full congregational model to really discussion groups and cultural centers like Conway Hall is now. And I honestly think that was a mistake. I understand why they did it. I know that many humanists are allergic to anything that even smells remotely like a church. But Adler understood, and I agree with him, that in order for a life stance to have any lasting impact, it must be supported by institutions which turn its ideas into action. Congregations are the powerhouses which turn philosophies into a social force. And it's striking to me that while those early proto-humanists, Adler and his ilk, created a number of incredibly important social institutions which are still significant today, the ethical movement had a hand in developing such institutions as the first free kindergarten in New York City, the first settlement houses, which were places where immigrants could get an education and help finding work, the NAACP, a major civil rights institution in America, and the ACLU. Today's humanist organizations have hardly built any institutions of any significance at all. And so I think they have relatively little social impact. Adler and Coit were people of significance in their day who had a major influence on social discussions of their time. And they built institutions which really made a difference in the lives of their members and in the cities of which they were a part. And humanism today is more of a talking shop. It's a thing people think about and carry in their heads, not a thing we do, not a thing we live out. And I think we could recover some of that institution building energy and that desire to change the world that the early ethical culturists and humanists had. I think this is particularly important because we live in a period of profound challenges. Obviously, we're living through a massive pandemic right now, which is a challenge of its own. But we also have major civic, political, and ethical crises. We're experiencing this amazing uprising of anti-racism, which is inspiring to me and following on the footsteps of work that many activists in St. Louis began when Mike Brown was killed 6 years ago. But in addition to that, we're seeing the rise of illiberal forces everywhere, from populist nationalism to neo-Nazis openly marching in American streets. Our political discourse is febrile and unpleasant. There seems to be a massive lack of trust in social institutions. These are all things humanists should be doing something about. And we would be much better positioned to do something about them if, I believe, there were ethical societies with hundreds of members in every city in the United Kingdom. And I really wish that Harold Blackham hadn't started to dismantle them. I believe that we humanists have a moral responsibility, a responsibility to recover our legacy as builders of institutions and changers and shapers of society. So I want you to consider reopening ethical societies to be places where humanists and others can gather to dedicate ourselves to our highest ideals. They don't have to be churchy. They don't have to feel like traditional religions, but they do have to be places where people can gather in community to worship the good. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to pause now before I start offending everyone and take any questions that you might have. And I can stay as long as you like because I haven't got anything else to do. My congregation is closed. I see Ruth's question. Okay, I can answer that when we get back.
Okay, I was just about to say we'll start back now. Thank you for that, Ruth. That's a very good point. Okay, we'll just give people a couple of seconds to get themselves ready, and then we'll start with the questions. And so we'll start with we'll start with Ruth's question. I think we're nearly all back now.
Okay, so in case people can't see Ruth's question, this is it. Am I understanding correctly that ethical societies welcome people who believe all sorts of different things, including people who identify in terms of a particular religious faith? That might be a difference between ethical societies and humanist groups, perhaps. Can you say a little about that? Yes, Ruth, I can. So yes, you are understanding correctly in the sense that we are a non-creedal congregation, which means that we do not require people to sign or make any statement of faith to be a member of our community. And people can believe many different things and still be a member of our community. Now, it's a bit complicated because we have a set of core values which holds our community together rather than specific doctrines or beliefs. And what a number of those values are about intellectual responsibility and, using evidence and reason to discern the truth, right? And in my view, I'm just speaking personally here, not for the Ethical Society of St. Louis. In my view, if you follow your reason where it leads, it will get you eventually to the point where there's no God, right? So I think that it's difficult to maintain a belief in God and follow all our values at the same time. But the important thing to stress is that we don't require people to be ethically perfect in order to join our congregation, right? We don't require them always to follow all the other values. So we wouldn't necessarily require them always to follow this one either. We don't want people to erect a barrier which would prevent people from being a member of the community. Now, in practice, particularly in Missouri, which is a conservative, very Christian part of the United States, the vast majority of our members are non-believers. The vast majority. So in practice, we don't run up against this tension because people who want to join a Christian church, there's literally hundreds in St. Louis they can join. We have some people who also consider themselves Jewish, but Judaism has always been a culture and an ethnic identity as well as a religious set of practices. So there's always been a breadth of how people understand that term. So hopefully that answers the question. But yeah, it might be slightly different from humanist group, an explicit humanist group. But I've actually visited plenty of humanist groups that have religious members who just like the discussions and are interested in the topics. Okay, I can't possibly have answered every question that people have.
While we're waiting for the next question, I thought, okay, I'll continue my question anyway. We do have a question, but yeah, I thought it might be quite nice if you just mentioned some of the things that I know it's not the focus of the talk, but ethical societies do, like some of the things I remember when kids sort of get to a certain age, they present to the congregation, that kind of thing. Just to give us a general idea, and then we'll go to the other questions.
Yeah, so we are a fully fledged congregational community which offers almost everything you would expect to find in like your local church. So we have weekly meetings on Sunday mornings, which is our main community gathering. We have discussion events and educational programming to help people understand more about humanism and about life. We have things like Tai Chi and yoga groups and social things like potlucks and cycling groups. And we also have a fully fledged equivalent of a Sunday school where we have many, many children who are taught a curriculum that's about ethical development and free thinking. We're not imposing our beliefs on them. It includes visits to many different congregations in the area so they can learn about different religious beliefs. And Part of that, the thing Ben was mentioning, is that part of our Sunday school is our sort of equivalent of a bar mitzvah or confirmation process, where kids go through a 2-year process of values clarification when they are entering their teen years, and then it ends in a presentation to the whole community where they give a talk about their own values and how they want to live life and what's important to them. And so we have a huge range of things. By the way, you're all welcome to join literally anything we do. We've translated tons of it to online, so it's really easy to visit right now if you want to be part of any of our groups. You don't have to be a member to join any of the things we do. But when we were in regular session before coronavirus hit, we had about 200-300 events a month, if you add up all the different groups that are meeting weekly in our building and in our community. So it's a big congregation with a hell of a lot going on. Yeah. I'm going to start going through some of these questions.
Yeah. So there's one. Shall I read them out again, or do you want to just pick them up from the feed?
Yeah, I'm happy to read them. So okay. Jamie has a question. I seem to mention some negativity towards Harold Blackham in terms of him moving away from the Ethical Society and engaging with humanism in the UK. Does that indicate a conflict between the Ethical Society and the core beliefs of humanism? I think the answer is no. I don't think there's anything about the core values of ethical culture and contemporary secular humanism that is distinct. You could take the consensus statement on humanism that Humanists International put out, or the Amsterdam Declaration or something like that, and we would subscribe to every single piece of it. I don't think there's any distinction in core values whatsoever. I think where the difference is in how to operationalize humanism. If humanism is a life stance or set of interconnected values, I have a chapter in the Oxford Handbook on Humanism coming out shortly about how humanism is an interconnected series of values, so you can look that up. If that's what it is, then the question is, well, what do you do with it, right? How do you actually put it into practice? And Adler's idea was that you had to build communities and institutions so that it could live in the world. And Blackham and other more contemporary humanists seem to think that actually what you really need to do was sit down and talk about it, right? And that it was more of an intellectual movement rather than a social movement equivalent to a religion. And again, hopefully I expressed in my talk that I understand why they may have taken that route, but I do think it was a mistake. But that's not because I disagree with any of their values. It's because I disagree with the way of operationalizing those values and making them have an impact in the world. Like, honestly, if you think about, I think it's different in the UK, where the British Humanists Association, Humanists UK, is a really fantastic institution. In the US, the American Humanists Association is a bit weedy. We've got a lot of work we could be doing, and it doesn't have a huge impact on the cultural conversation. And I think partly it's because there aren't the institutions to give it local support. And that's one of the major roles congregations play in social movements. They're hubs for turning ideas into action. So that's my distinction. It's a question about strategy. It's not about values. I consider myself a humanist, and I was a member of Humanists UK before I moved to the US, and I'm a member of the American Humanist Association now. So I have no beef with humanism. I am a humanist. Okay, so Anastasia asks, if you do not repurpose older traditions and rituals like the Unitarian churches do you have any new rituals or ceremonies which aren't derived from any religions which you structure your meetings around? Well, like any community, we have developed some things that are distinctly ours that have grown up over time. I'm now trying to think of ones that aren't too embarrassing and silly. I mean, our coming of age process is sort of like that. It's not a repurposing, like we didn't take the confirmation process in Christianity and try and reverse engineer it. It's something that grew up out of our own community's needs, and is really focused on the desire to provide a space for young people to determine for themselves what their most important values are. So it's a kind of values clarification process that's quite unlike anything you'd see in a traditional religion, because in most traditional religions, they're trying to teach the kids to be that religion, whereas we're trying to teach the kids to determine what life they want to lead. And that's a different kind of purpose. And so our program is quite different. Another example is we have our own scouting groups, which have been built from the ground up to be inclusive. I don't recall if it's the same in the United Kingdom. I don't think it is, but scouting in the United States, particularly for boys, has been incredibly homophobic and not accepting of atheists for a long time. And so there's been the development of a wholly new type of scouting that we have in our ethical society. And there are festivals that we do throughout the year that are our own things, but they tend not to get too much ritualized too much, because people get nervous, right? Like our members still, they're like, oh, that's a bit religious for me. So, you know, there are things, but nothing's popping to mind that's particularly amazing. We need to develop some, don't we? I'm starting to feel like we need to have more. Okay, how do I say your name? Is it Ushi? That's right. Okay, good. Yep. So how many members do you have, and what's the trend? Oh, trend in terms of membership? We have about 400 pledging members. So those are people who give us money to keep going. We don't tithe. To be a member, you have to submit a pledge form, but it can have $0 on it. So there's no minimum. Anyone can be a member, but those are the people who have submitted pledge forms and been admitted formally into membership. And then we reach many, many hundreds more people than that every month, because tons of people come to our programs that are not members. In terms of participation right now, we used to have about 140 to 200 people turn up on Sundays. And in Zoom, we've got about 150 people in about 110 connections every week. So it's pretty similar. Our membership has been stable for a long time. We've been trying to grow it. Congregation, I could go into congregational growth literature here and bore everybody, but it's difficult to grow congregations of our size significantly, because then they become any more people and I just can't remember the names of everybody, and that makes people feel bad. And so it becomes a different model of congregation entirely. We're moving into, once you get up to 600, 700, 800 people, you're moving into a kind of corporate church model, which is very different from what we have, which is a kind of large local church. And people are very resistant to that sort of change. But in a context where congregational participation and membership is declining across the board, we are staying steady. So we're doing better than most congregations. And we are the largest ethical society in the world. So, and one of the largest humanist congregations anywhere on the planet. So we're doing well, like we're doing great. We don't have any problems with membership. We have tons of new people coming every Sunday, even now. I got someone who wanted to join as a member today, and they've never been inside the building. I'm like, well, I don't know whether I would do that, but I'm happy to accept their application. What happens at a typical Sunday morning meeting of an ethical society? Asked Jace. So, okay, it depends on the ethical society. Because it's an anti-dogmatic tradition, each community is democratically run, and so each meeting takes a different form depending on where you are. But our one is, we have someone who chairs the meeting, who's like the greeter and says a welcome and welcome to the ethical society, etc. There are 3 pieces of live music interspersed throughout by different types of musician each week. We strive to provide diversity of music to represent the diversity and creativity of the human species. So one week we might have someone playing the harp. The next week it might be a bluegrass band. The next week it might be a whistling trio like we had once. And the next it might be spoken word poetry. Like, it's very different from week to week. There's 3 pieces of music. There's opening words from a member of the community about why they're a member of the ethical society, or sometimes a rant on a topic that they have chosen. And then there is the main address, which is about 20 minutes to half an hour of speaking. Now, one of the really interesting things about ethical societies, unlike almost any religious tradition, is that the clergy do not speak every week. I speak once a month, and visiting speakers who we pay speak all the other times. So we have a diversity of voices present, which is again in line with our values. We do not want to create the idea that I have all the answers, because that would be a messed up community if people thought that I had all the answers. We want to get as many different voices as possible who's still in line with our values in front of people so that they can give different ideas. And we organize the programming year through annual and monthly themes. So this year, our annual theme was stages of life, and each month was like stages of life from birth in the first month through to death and legacy and things like that in the last months. So that's kind of what it looks like. Ben asks, are there cities where there are both Sunday assemblies and ethical culture societies? Yes, there are both. They're not in St. Louis because they keep trying to start Sunday assemblies and then all their people keep joining us because we just do that on a bigger scale more regularly anyway. But in New York, there's a Sunday assembly and the New York Society for Ethical Culture. In Austin, I think there's a Sunday assembly and an ethical culture society. So there are cities where there are both, and I think they can happily coexist. And in many places, ethical societies have offered our building to Sunday assemblies. We're quite happy to collaborate with other local humanist organizations. We give away our building for free all the time because we recognize it's a resource we have for the community. So I'm actually writing a book right now with Sanderson Jones of the Sunday Assembly, and there's a lot of commonality between what we do. Ours is more of a traditional experience than the kind of high-energy kind of atheist Pentecostalism of a Sunday Assembly, but it's very similar in terms of the underlying values, I think. Simon says Scouting was a focus of humanism in the UK before I was involved. UK Scouting is a non-religious pledge as a result. Scouting is available to people of all faiths as well as people who are humanists, atheists, or have no firm faith. Well, that's good. It's not true in America, where it's still the one group of people they still openly discriminate against is atheists. So
in the UK, it's also relatively recent that they've allowed atheists to be scout leaders.
It's so outrageous. I mean, just the fact that we live in societies where you can openly discriminate against atheists and humanists, but no other religious group is just such bullshit. It makes me really angry, particularly in America. Very infuriating. Ushi asks again, are there any campaigns run by the Ethical Society? Do you mean like social action campaigns or like the ones that Humanists UK run? We don't have a very strong national organization that's able to do national campaigns like Humanists UK does, partly because America is really big, y'all, and the resources required to run national campaigns in the United States are tremendous. And so we don't have that level of clout, but individual societies do get involved in many different campaigns at the local level, usually through coalitions with other congregations, honestly. So the Ethical Society of St. Louis is working alongside many other liberal congregations on all sorts of things. Right now, a lot of racial justice work to try and change our voting system, to get rid of all the gerrymandering that's happening, to enable people to vote by mail during COVID, things like that. Lots of environmental activism, lots of LGBTQIA plus rights activism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we are involved on a local level in a lot of campaigns. Ruth asks, where does the money come from? It comes from our members primarily, who voluntarily donate money because of the value that they get from the institution. And it comes from the endowment that we've built up from member contributions over the years. And then some of it also from renting the building out to other organizations. So that's basically it. We don't force people to give us money. We just ask them to give us money. And amazingly, they do. Yes, so there's a lot of interesting discussion about scouting. So it does seem like there's similar issues in some areas of scouting in the UK than in the US. Yes, Ben asks about ethical culture scouting. Yes, we have a navigators troop. That's exactly what we have. I think we had one of the first navigators troops.
Okay, while we're waiting for the next couple of questions, could you tell us something about like are ethical societies actively being seeded? And ethical leaders, are they, you actually have a central sort of training scheme, like a not Bible college?
So I'll answer those in reverse. To be the term for clergy in the ethical movement, the professional leadership of the ethical societies, is leader. So that's our equivalent honorific to something like reverend or rabbi. It's incredibly pompous and old-fashioned, so I prefer people to use it as little as possible. But that's technically the honorific title that is granted to someone who's gone through the training program. And there is a training program, although how it works is it's taught by the existing leaders to the trainees. So it's kind of all done in-house. There are very few of us, right? There are only 24 ethical societies, period. Most are so small they don't have professional leadership at all. And so there are maybe 30 ethical leaders alive in the world today. So it's a teeny tiny movement, absolutely fractional in the big scheme of things. And we teach each other. So the people say, I really want to do this as a career, and they apply, and then they get kind of led into the process. And there are 3 retreats a year where we meet with each other and teach each other stuff through seminars, but most of it's done through distance learning, honestly. And then at the end of the program, when you've done all your papers and all that stuff and learned all about the history of the movement and the philosophy and everything, you go and you do a year-long placement in an existing ethical society. And then you really learn everything you need to know about doing this job. It's a really weird job. Like I'm constantly struck by the fact that I'm literally professional clergy for a congregation that doesn't believe in God or traditional religion. It's so unusual. I feel so lucky because I love the work and I think it's incredibly important. And these institutions are very rare. I mean, perhaps the only comparable institution in England now is New Unity Church in London, which is basically a humanist congregation, a Unitarian humanist congregation. And apart from that, there's basically none. And it's so weird. Yeah, they pay me, Patricia. Can you believe it? Yes, they pay me. I'm remunerated fairly for my work. And it's my full-time job. And yeah, it comes from the money that the congregants pledge every year. So I have to keep them happy. Yes, lead funerals and weddings and baby namings, although sadly I don't get to choose the names of the babies myself. But yeah, all that sort of stuff. We do all the ceremonial aspects of a humanist celebrant in the UK. So I do a lot of weddings, actually. Before COVID, I did tons of weddings. I love weddings. So I really, really enjoy that aspect of the work. And memorials are profoundly important. I think memorials are one of the times when humanist values really come to life for people. They really feel how valuable it is to have a community of people who appreciate that this life is all that we have, and that therefore it's incredibly important to use it well. And that if you have a memorial that starts on that premise rather than on some religious premise, it's a totally different experience. I did my own father's memorial, which was something I don't recommend that, I have to say. Ushi asked a really interesting question about the NAACP. Now, the NAACP is a civil rights organization that was originally called, which is where the acronym is from, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is, it now just goes by NAACP because of the change in the I'm forgetting the word, the change in the way that term is understood now, but they themselves developed from earlier civil rights organizations, which were in part founded by a leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture at the time. So one of the, I'm trying to look up right now while I'm speaking, so I'm being a bit bad at speaking, but one of the leaders of the New York Society for Ethical Culture was involved heavily in civil rights struggles, as the ethical movement has been since its founding. It's been an anti-racist movement since the beginning, as I said, establishing some of the first settlement houses and pushing back against discrimination against immigrants. But also in the civil rights struggle, it was heavily involved in starting some of these early institutions. And I can find you some information and link it in the chat because it is really interesting. So the guy who is most important in terms of this was Henry Moskowitz, who was a leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture, and that was 1913 to 1917, and he was involved in the earliest founding of the organization that became the NAACP. So this is what I mean when I say institution building is really important. Like these institutions, like the ACLU as well, which we were part of starting a precursor institution to the ACLU. These were people who were really involved in their communities, who thought that their, what we would call humanism, meant that the world had to look a particular way. And so that you needed to do something to make it look that way. And so they went out and were involved in the building of these institutions, and those institutions have had a major impact on the world. I mean, this is some of the kind of hidden history of humanism that most humanists don't know about. Like we can lay claim to some of the most important civil rights institutions in the history of the world. I mean, most people know that humanists were profoundly influential in the drafting of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. Many people don't know that Eleanor Roosevelt, who chaired the drafting committee, was, although not a formal member, frequently attended the New York Society for Ethical Culture and was a participant in their encampment for citizenship, which was a unique summer school for citizenship for teenagers during the civil rights era, which was interracial, which was almost unheard of at the time. It brought both black and white kids together to learn about citizenship and activism at a time when that was considered very radical. That was established by the New York Society for Ethical Culture. Eleanor Roosevelt was a backer. Martin Luther King spoke there and spoke about the importance of the institution. And then she went on to help draft the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. These are humanist ideals, which are at the founding of our whole common concept of human rights. That whole framework wouldn't make any difference. UNESCO was largely founded by self-identified humanists, with at least two of the major branches of UNESCO being headed by humanists who were explicit about their humanistic aims for those organizations. And I feel like we should talk about this more. We've had a major impact on the history of the world. And I got so excited, I unplugged my own headset. This is something that many of my members have become used to at the Ethical Society. I just go off on these tangents. So sorry about that. You should read my chapter in the Oxford Handbook on Humanism about humanism in practice, because it goes into all these parts of history all across the world, including in India, Africa, where humanists have had a major impact on society. So anyway. Yes, I heard about the National Memorial Ceremony. I was talking to Andrew Copson this morning on Facebook, and he told me how great it was. Tens of thousands of participants, he said, which is amazing. Okay, so Jace asked something. It seems that ethical societies are essentially humanism plus institutions, i.e. founded on the principles of humanism, but with additional activities that foster community building. So what are the common arguments against ethical societies over basic humanism organizations that would prevent ethical societies from replacing basic humanism organizations? Oh, this is a fun one. So I have found I came into doing this work with the ethical movement after being a kind of, I was a grad student for a long time. While I was a grad student at Harvard, I got very involved in the Humanist Hub at Harvard, which is their attempt to create a community for humanists there. And I started speaking at humanist communities all around the USA about how we needed to build more communities like this before I knew about ethical societies. And I got a lot of pushback from people because a lot of humanists, particularly in America, have a number of concerns that they frequently raise when I talk about doing this sort of thing. And so they include, first, they seem to think that every community necessarily becomes a cult, right? Whenever you get together with other people to do serious stuff together, they're always worried that it will slide into cultishness and dogma. Particularly if there's an identified leader of that community, they seem to be allergic to the idea of leadership, as if leadership is inherently anti-democratic or authoritarian. And I like to say, firstly, not every community is a cult. That's just simply a fact. There are plenty of examples of communities all over the world that are not cultish. And not every leader is a dear leader. You can have responsible leadership, which is responsive to the people they lead. You can have mechanisms to keep leaders in check. And in fact, my feeling is that every group that doesn't specify the responsibilities and limitations of leadership has a de facto leader. And those de facto leaders are often much more authoritarian than specifically enumerated leaders who have limitations on their power and what they can do. So I'm always in favor of saying who you think the leaders of your group are and why, and what they can and can't do. So I think there's this misperception about community. It's particularly strong in the United States because, of course, religion is such a toxic force in US culture. And I totally get that. I mean, religion has decimated many areas of American public life. The conservative strain of religion that has had the most political impact is just disastrous for civic life in America. And so I understand that people don't want to do anything that's like that. But my feeling is that it's just so irrational to take that view. And I don't think it's actually humanistic. And here's why. I believe religions grew up to respond to fundamental human needs. Our need for community, our need to address the biggest questions of human life. Why are we here? Why does anything matter? How should we treat each other? What happens when we die? Those are questions we all ask at some points in our lives that everyone needs to grapple with. Our need to find meaning and purpose and to share our life's most important moments with other people. Those are all human needs. They are part of the sort of organism we are. And religions developed to meet those needs. The needs came first, the religion was secondary. So I think it is totally mistaken if humanists today want to say we shouldn't build organizations which fulfill those needs because they look too much like religions. Religion has colonized all these human things, and it's made many non-religious people believe that they can't have them because they're religious. And that's bullshit, right? There's nothing inherently religious about singing in a group or about getting together to mourn someone who has died or about feeling intense relationships with other people. That's human. So I think we should recolonize is a bad term. We should take back all these areas that religion has claimed for its own and say, no, these are human things. You don't get to have a monopoly on those things. And so that's where I totally agree with Sanderson Jones and what he's trying to do with Sunday Assembly. Religions don't have a monopoly on ecstasy and spiritual feeling and celebration of life. Those can be all of ours. They're our birthright as human beings, and we shouldn't just give them up to the dusty old churches with their miserable priests, particularly because they do it so badly. Like, because they do it in such a way that is so stultifying of so much that's important about human life. Non-religious congregations could be way better than religious congregations because they don't have to deal with all the croft of religion that has built up over millennia. We can get back to the source of things, to those human needs that they initially responded to. We can respond to them again. I'm ranting again. Okay, so I'll stop. Okay, so would you like to say anything about countries other than the UK or US? So there's no ethical societies now anywhere except the USA, except for South Place Ethical Society that isn't really a congregation anymore and doesn't have any connection with the ethical movement as a whole. They've all died off. But it's really weird when you look at the history. There are tendrils where this little tiny American-born movement reached. Like there are statues of Felix Adler in little towns in Germany. Like freaking weird. Like there are places where his philosophy reached. He was very influential in his day and now totally forgotten. I don't know so much about the history of that. I intend to take a sabbatical next year and do a little research about the impact of ethical humanism on humanism as a whole. And I'll get back to you. I'll come back and do another talk, hopefully in person, and tell you more about that because I don't know enough about it. Okay, Alan has a question. How socially and racially mixed are your societies? Great question, particularly now in this time when racial justice is on the forefront. So the ethical movement, I'm just going to be honest with you here, has been since its founding a primarily white, affluent, well-educated movement. It was founded by well-off, like Temple Emmanuel was rich New Yorkers. And a group of those rich New York Jews split off from that to found this new thing, which also appealed to other wealthy, well-educated New Yorkers. And one of the struggles of any religious movement or community is to reach out beyond the initial type of people you bring. Because whenever someone new comes and they don't see anyone like them there, they feel like it's not a place for them. And so they're not so likely to come back. And so you have this terrible catch-22 where you always want to increase the diversity of your community, but because you don't have that diversity to begin with, it's really hard to increase it. So that's a major focus of the Ethical Society of St. Louis right now. We're particularly concerned about the racial diversity of our community. It is not exclusively white, but it is predominantly white. And we recognize that unless we're reaching all types of people, our humanism isn't a full humanism. Because humanism should speak to everybody by definition. And so if we're not speaking to everybody, we're doing something wrong. So we need to change what we're doing. And we've got a whole range of things in place to try and change that. We've had a lot of success over the last 6 years since I started serving the community in reaching younger people. Our membership has trended significantly younger over the last few years. And we now have a vibrant community of younger members, which was not the case when I joined the community. I think it helps that I'm a millennial myself. So I'm just a millennial, I'm 37. So I'm just on the cusp of not being a millennial, but I am one. I think that having people in leadership positions who have the identities that you want to bring in is critical. And that's something that we're looking at. But we haven't had as much success in the racial diversity of our community. And that hasn't stopped us from being a really outspoken voice on racial justice. And I could speak for hours about our role in the post-Mike Brown racial justice protests in Ferguson, etc. But that hasn't translated into membership of people of color. And that there are many reasons for that, but that's just the situation we're in right now. Okay, I'm going to answer this question from Anastasia, and then that's going to be the last one because I actually do have to take my little puppy for a walk because she's looking at me with a sad face. Do you ever collaborate with Unitarians, Unitarian Universalists, Quaker Universalists, or other religious progressives? And they're assuming that given the heritage, you must have connections with humanistic Jews. Yes, 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 and yes. We collaborate with all sorts of liberal religious groups and not liberal ones on occasion if we can find common ground, particularly the Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists, as they're called in the United States, who are very close kindred of ours. They are very, very close in terms of how they run their congregations and in terms of their core values. And we often trade members with the Unitarian churches in St. Louis. Some people find their stuff too churchy and too Christian, and they come to us, which feels more secular to them. Some people find our gatherings a bit too rationalistic and heady, and they don't get that kind of spiritual oomph that they're looking for, and they like the Unitarian church a little bit more. And we're happy, you know, people find the place that they want to be in. Secretly, of course, I'm competing with them and I want to be bigger than any of them. But in public, I just say, we're happy to trade members with each other. So we collaborate with them on many, many things. One thing that we've collaborated a lot with them recently is LGBTQIA plus issues. Obviously, more conservative in Missouri than in anywhere in the United Kingdom on these issues, and there's still a lot of work to be done there, particularly in terms of protections for trans people, which is an issue that many of our even more mainstream liberal congregations have trouble with in the United States. But the Unitarians and the ethical culturists are side by side in affirming the dignity and worth of trans folks. So we work with them on many, many different things. And yes, I do have a connection with the humanistic Jews. I gave a presentation to them about the links between Judaism and ethical culture to one of our humanist Jewish congregations not too long ago. So I'm always happy to visit those people and learn from them. Although it's interesting that not so many of our members today are Jewish culturally or by background. It really, the ethical movement really separated much more cleanly from its Jewish origins than Unitarian Universalism has separated from Christianity. It still feels quite Christian when I go to a Unitarian service, partly because of the shape of their buildings, honestly. But our places don't really feel Jewish, and most of our members wouldn't know that we had a Jewish foundation unless we told them. Okay, thank you everyone for your questions. I really appreciate it. I hope you had a good time. I certainly did.
Thank you very much. You can now all demute yourself if you want to clap